Hi everybody, this is Bonnie Barker with Bonnie Bay Crochet, and today you've come to video number 2 on All About Yarn. And today we're going to be talking about the different thicknesses of yarn and this really cool category system that will help you understand this better. So many of you know that there are literally tens of thousands of styles and types of yarn on the market today. And it's really hard to just categorize it into 6 or 7 categories. In fact, in today's discussion, I'm not even going to talk much about thread, because crochet thread is an entirely different category and it has a completely different numbering system. So I'm not going to address that right now. But what I am going to address is everything, or at least the categories in general, from lace weight, which is the really thin stuff, to the jumbo size, which is super thick yarn. This is actually a number 7. So on this chart, I'm going to put that yarn label information diagram right here. The lace weight that I showed you is labeled a 0, or it is considered in the 0 category, whereas this jumbo yarn is considered the jumbo category or number 7 category. I could drone on and on about all the differences in each of these numbers, but instead I'm just going to briefly talk about them, and then we're going to focus in on the category that is really the most popular with most of my audience here on the Bonnie Bay Crochet YouTube channel. So 0 category would be considered the lace weight, which is very, very thin. And as you can imagine, as I go up the number category, these yarns get a little bit thicker. Number 1 category would be yarns like sock weight yarns that I'm really enjoying. Sock weight, another word for number 1 category, would be the fingering weight. In some countries, actually in many countries, this yarn weight symbol system is not even used in the manufacturing process. So when you get the yarn, there's no handy dandy number that has that little symbol with the ball on it. So what is one to do? Well, you can easily look at the number of stitches per inch that sometimes is written on the label. That'll help to give you an indicator of the thickness of the yarn. Another way is other words that they use on the label. For example, I'm going to say like number 1, we just talked about sock weight yarn. This is the kind of yarn, let me show you. This is the weight of yarn that I love to use for a lot of my crocheted scarves, because it allows me to make very thick texturized stitches, but with the very thin yarn it still ends up being a very flexible drapey fabric. So the really thin yarns work well for that. They also can call this fingering weight or sock weight yarn. Now for number 2, this is called fine. Let me double check that. Yes, fine. Some people call a number 2 a sport weight yarn. So if you hear the word sport weight, that is often in the category of a number 2. And number 3 is one of my favorite kinds of yarns. It's called DK weight. The words or the initials DK stand for double knitting. What that means? Well, I don't know, double knitting. It's a style of knitting, but that type of yarn is used in many other things besides double knitting. And it's a little bit thicker than the number 2. It's a little bit thinner than the number 3. Now I could go through categorically and give you the numbers of how wide these should be to the thousandth place in numbers, but I'm not sure that's really going to really explain a lot to you, and that's something you can just look at the chart if you are really into numbers in that way. But there is a certain range, and I'm going to show you some things right now. Now the kind of yarn that most of us use more often than not would be the number 4 weight yarns. Okay, so let's look at some of these examples of number 4 weight yarns. Caron Simply Soft is a common one that I know a lot of you like and have used. And again, this is not an endorsement of any of these particular fibers. This is just for example purposes only. The Red Heart Super Saver yarns that you find just about everywhere, those are generally a number 4 weight yarn. Knit Picks makes a yarn called Brava, called worsted, which is again a number 4 weight yarn. One of my favorites, paint box yarns. Again, not a paid endorsement, just as an example. So here's another. Here's one more that we're going to use as an example. This is actually a fancier yarn. This is not acrylic. This is called Cumulus. This is by Juniper Moon Farm. This is a single ply yarn, and we're going to talk about that in a later video. Lots of terminology to cover in this series. So I'm not teaching you anything new. You know there are many, many different kinds of number 4 weight yarns. Let's go ahead and banter around some of the terms used for this weight yarn in case, again, that you see some yarn that is spun outside the US, which a lot of great yarn is spun outside the US, and it doesn't have the numbering system on it. Oftentimes this is called worsted weight yarn. Another common term, especially in the UK, is Aran weight yarn, A-R-A-N, okay, after the Aran Isles. And sometimes people will say terminology 4-ply or 6-ply, and I really kind of like to steer away from that kind of terminology because you can have a worsted weight yarn that is a single ply, which is much thicker than what people think of when you think of a single ply. This is actually called a roving yarn. But it is the same weight category as these other worsted weight yarns. Okay, that said, many of you who have experienced crocheting other patterns, just across the internet with your favorite yarn will find that oftentimes you get a different result if you're using a different yarn than the crocheter that you were watching on YouTube or perhaps the designer that designed the pattern. Why is that? Gauge aside, that is because there is a difference in size even within the weight categories of each and every one of these yarns, which is why it's really important that you hear what I'm about to say. And this will affect the size of the projects that you do. It can affect the drape. It can affect a lot of the outcome. So what is one to do? Well, I think this is the answer to that is experience. It's just understanding with practice how particular brands of yarns behave. For example, I happen to know that the Care on Simply Soft worsted weight yarn is definitely on the thinner side than the Red Heart yarn. And I want to show you right here. I have purchased a small microscope and a micrometer so that I can measure the actual width of these yarns under the microscope. And I want you to see how these vary. Notice how the gray Super Saver yarn is significantly thinner than the Cumulus yarn, also, and the paint box yarn. Some yarns tend to be beefier than others. They tend to be whiter. Some tend to be thinner, and that's all within the same exact category of yarns. Because of that, you just need to be aware. This will especially come into play if you're making projects where you're making a stash buster project, which is a project using various yarns of the same size from your stash or within the same category. Now, if you mix in the brands, which you can do, just be aware that they may crochet up pretty differently. And it's not because they're made of anything different, but they are just manufactured in a way that they are slightly different in size from one another, which is why each of these number weight categories that the symbols represent, there is a range. There is a range. And that information is documented. Like I said, if you want that to the thousandths of an inch, you can get that information. Although I think just working with it, just having that experience as that yarn runs through our fingers is really the best teacher here rather than a chart. But if you've never used a particular yarn before, sometimes there is that information as far as the width goes, as far as the yarn. A lot of times it's not there. You just have to experience it. And one solution you can do if you're just not sure about a yarn, especially if it's a more expensive yarn and you really don't want to spend let's say, $80 or $90 on something that you just don't know, order one. Just have them order one, and then you can, play with that yarn. A lot of times, yarn stores, local yarn stores, will have what they call a yarn tasting. And I recently attended one of those for Barocco yarns in South Carolina, and it was delightful because I worked with yarns. I was given a bag of yarns. They were all basically the same size. They were all DK weight yarns, but they all had different behaviors, slightly different thicknesses. And by just having a little sampling of each, I was able to get a taste of what it felt like working with these yarns, so that if I really liked something in particular, I could keep that in mind for a future design. Well, I hope this is just touching on this subject lightly, but I hope you enjoyed this. If there's any question that you have, please feel free to post in the video comments below. I do read those and I do respond to them as often as I can. And also, if there are other things that you want to learn about yarn, let me know. Also, don't forget to check out video number 1 on this website. I'll go ahead and put that at the end of this video so that you can just click on that, or you can check the video description below for that link. God bless. Bye-bye.